So what I do, what I've spent the last 20 years doing, is dealing with major catastrophic incidents involving environment, health and safety problems. So that's everything from environmental spills, water pollution, tanks overflowing, right through to hazardous explosions, major rail crashes and corporate manslaughter. So everything right up to very serious criminal charges involving both individuals and companies. And this is really just to give you quite a high level overview on the sorts of risks that you have to be aware of if you're operating in any sort of business in the UK or indeed offshore in the UK, because a lot of this will cover North Sea gas, oil terminals as well. And increasingly the UK's health and safety law is very much seen as being gold standard globally. So even in a lot of developing countries, Middle East in particular, they are starting to adopt a lot of UK principles. So while some of these may not apply everywhere in the world, a lot of global companies are deciding they're going to take the high standards from the UK and they're going to apply them to their business, even if the local laws don't quite deal with them in the same way. So what I'm going to look at today are a few things, but under these broad headings. So environmental liabilities, what are the requirements on companies operating in the UK to stay compliant with environmental laws? I'm going to focus more though on health and safety. What are the potential offences for companies? What are the potential offences for individuals? Because it looks at both. I'm going to mention the Corporate Manslaughter Act. That does come up. It does come up in investigations that I have to deal with. But roll that into the practical impact of an incident. What happens when something goes wrong? Well, who are the sorts of people who will come to site and expect information from you, from your businesses, from your colleagues? Finally, slightly different health and safety and environmental, but a few slides on bribery and corruption. Again, risks to a business, risks to individuals. So all of what we're talking about today, important to understand, this is criminal law. Different areas of the world, these are dealt with perhaps slightly differently. Some it's more civil, it's an insurance issue, you pay some money out and that's it. But in the UK, and certainly across a lot of Europe, these are criminal. So if you are convicted of these, it's the same as if you'd attacked somebody, stabbed them, broken into their house and stolen things. That is criminal law. And so this applies to companies and to individuals in the same way, and you go through the criminal court system. So you get a criminal record for health and safety breaches, the same as if you'd stolen something from a shop in Newcastle. Okay. So environmental framework, what does that look like? It's quite different. The two areas we're going to talk about, although they often get covered by the same individuals or the same teams in a company, they're two quite different areas of law. What I mean by that is environmental legislation is very much compliance based, heavily influenced by Europe, heavily influenced by European and indeed global standards. And basically, you can't do anything that affects the environment unless you have some sort of process control, typically permits, licenses, permissions. So if you don't have one of those, you're not allowed to impact the environment, and if you do have one of those, it'll tell you exactly what you can and can't do. So it might say you can emit a certain volume of this particular chemical into the air, but if you go above that, you're in breach. And if you're in breach and you don't sort it out, potentially that's where you go to court, you get fined, or worse, they can shut your plant down. So we'll look at those in a second. Quick word on water as well. Water, there are specific requirements around abstraction, so taking water out of the ground. There are still quite a lot of companies, even in the modern world, who have their own water supplies because they use huge volumes. And they have to obviously be quite careful what they do with that, not just the amount they take out, but anything that goes back in. Well, the more common one is pollution. So if you have any sort of drainage systems that go into water courses, some ought to be diverted into tanks or into sewage where they're treated. Others are possibly allowed to go into water streams, but the problem is often if something goes wrong. So you have a huge chemical plant. In theory, the only thing that goes in the river is rainwater drainage down surface water drains, and then one of your bunds collapses on a tank and a whole load of chemicals goes in the wrong drain and then goes into the river. That's a major issue. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. Waste, I'll spend a little bit more time on this shortly, but essentially that's the bulk of what I deal with. So I have colleagues who set these permits up. That's non-contentious. I deal with stuff when it goes wrong. So where people have got disposed of waste incorrectly. Sometimes that is an innocent mistake. People have put the wrong label on or they've analysed it, but increasingly it's not. It's very deliberate. Environmental waste and waste disposal is fast becoming one of the biggest areas for organised crime because the amount of money involved or the amount that can be saved by not doing it properly is so significant. So there are some pretty nasty individuals and nasty organisations getting into environmental waste disposal. Due diligence on transactions, that simply means you buy or sell a company and you have to check out what their permits allow them to do. Normally that's fairly straightforward, but you can imagine if you're buying a company that does a lot of work with chemicals, petrochemicals, hazardous substances, you want to know that all of that's in place, because if it's not, that means your company's suddenly worth a fraction of what you're paying for it because you can't operate properly. And if it all goes wrong, what happens with the enforcement? Who are the bodies that enforce? What is it they can do? So we'll look at each of those as we go through. So the idea of process control, and it links through, and we'll come on to waste in a second, is this idea of cradle to grave regulation. So the idea is that you can't just look at your bit. So if you are a manufacturing company, you can't just look at what you make. You've got to know everything that comes into your plant. You have to know the processes of what you do with those materials, and you need to know where everything goes that's a waste product. So everything from the beginning to the end of the life of that product, you have to understand. This used to be a lot more complicated because until these regulations in 2010, every aspect of environmental protection was dealt with separately. So you had separate rules for water, separate for waste, separate for air, which got a bit messy. But this brought it all together. So if you're a site who does anything that impacts the environment, you have to have a permit. And these permits are typically anything from 10 to sort of 20 pages long. They will list out all the specific activities you can do, all the chemicals you can use, all the emissions that you can put out of your process into the air, into water, into waste, how your process, how energy efficient your processes are. Very, very broad. And that's just an extract from the Act. So it's about taking the environment as a whole. So you've got to prevent or reduce as far as you can any impact on the environment. The other things to understand, in order to have one of these permits, you have to be what's called a fit and proper person. That's a very broad legal test, but that basically means if you keep getting this wrong, then at some point the regulator might say, right, you're not taking this seriously, we're not going to give you a permit, or we're going to suspend your permit. And suddenly, that's going to put you out of business. It's not used very often, but it's used a lot more as a threat. So it's quite an important threat if you get it wrong. And this idea of duty of care, we'll see it in the next slide a bit more for waste. But this idea is, like I say, for the cradle to grave bit, you can't just look at your role in that. You have a responsibility for everybody that you deal with in every part of your process. So if you do something that makes someone else be in breach, that's just as bad as you doing it yourself. So this is very deliberate, that you can't just in isolation say, this is me, I'm going to ignore everybody else. You've got to look at the whole picture. And you see it more clearly in waste particularly. This is very, very heavily regulated. Quite complicated framework, lots of different requirements. So you have consignment notes, you have waste transfer notes depending on how hazardous the substance is. But it's this same idea of duty of care. What do you produce? Who takes it away? where does it go? You've got to know all of those. Businesses, generally smaller businesses, still think it's okay that someone knocks on the door and says, I've got a great big van, I'll take your rubbish away, just give me some cash, I'll sort it out. That's not acceptable, because most of the time that is then dumped on a country road somewhere, and there are whole teams of people who will go out, they'll go through that rubbish, they will find something with your name on it, they will find a receipt or an envelope or a letter, they'll trace it back, and the fines are now very big for companies doing that. More commonly, where I see this, is where people have thought they've done the right thing. Somebody has perhaps had a contract with a waste carrier, and then they decide they want to save a bit of money, so they go to a slightly cheaper waste carrier. They don't realise that they're paying more because they've got the right licenses and the right consents to get rid of it, so they get somebody else who can't treat that sort of waste. And so you're into a problem. So people who are dealing with anything to do with waste should understand this, but sometimes in businesses, because it's complicated, you see mistakes being made. So it's not just taking it away as well. You've then got to know, where does that waste go at the end? What is going to happen to it? Is it going to have to be specially treated? And sometimes hazardous waste, you might be paying hundreds of pounds per tonne. So it's not just a few pounds or £1,000 for 100 tonnes. If you're tending nasty waste, hundreds and hundreds of pounds a tonne, you can see why people try and find ways to get around this. Hazardous waste, not only expensive to get rid of, but now you have to often pre-treat it. So you can't just give it to somebody, you've got to perform certain chemical changes to it. Liquids in particular are very often you've got to add things to liquids to make them solidify, so that they can then be disposed of more safely, and you pay for every stage of this. Hazardous waste is also very broad. Obviously things like chemicals, oils, flammable material, but also everyday items. Fluorescent strip lights, hazardous waste, really hard to get rid of. Tyres are another one, very expensive to get rid of tyres. Certain sorts of paints. So quite a lot of things that are normal everyday items are classed as hazardous waste when you try to dispose of it. Packaging waste, there are specific regulations around all the packaging material that you use. So if you're dealing with consumers, so if you're selling to the public, all those great big plastic packs that you get around anything you buy, or paper or all of that has to be accounted for. And that's why a lot of like supermarkets you go to, you see the big racks when they're putting everything on the shelves, they take away all the cardboard, all the plastic. That's not just because they want to do the right thing, that's because they have to measure it, and if they don't recycle a certain percentage of what they buy or make, they have to pay additional charges. Same for manufacturers of electrical goods, washing machines, freezers, all of them, they have to take away the old machines to recycle them and prove they're recycling certain percentages, and they're getting stricter and stricter each year. And transfrontier shipment of waste, this is really the same duty of care but for international waste. Because of the cost of disposing of things in the UK and in Europe, a lot more waste now gets put into large containers and shipped around the world to places who are perhaps less strict about the rules, but that doesn't matter. You've still got an expectation. You can't just put it in a container. You've got to know where it's going, and you've got to report to the UK authorities that it's going to a proper place for disposal. So all of these are quite serious, quite important for many of the sorts of businesses you may well end up in. So what happens if something goes wrong? Most of this in the UK is dealt with by the Environment Agency. It's a government regulator. They focus on waste and the environment generally. They also do a lot around flooding and flood protection. Local authorities have a certain role, but that's usually more for consumer-facing things. So shops on the high street having litter and rubbish problems, that's local authorities. But big manufacturing companies, that's the Environment Agency. They have very, very broad powers to investigate and to force you to hand over information. We'll look on it shortly when we do the health and safety slide, similar to the HSE. They've got a very, very significant powers. They have an enforcement policy as well. Not the most interesting read, I have to admit, but there's about 60, 70 pages that if something goes wrong, they tell you what they're going to do. So the more serious the breach, the more significant the penalty will be. But it shows you the thinking they go through about how far below the standard, the expected standard you've gone. And then these are the things that they can consider doing once they've gone through this policy. For smaller instances, smaller breaches, first time something goes wrong, it's not that serious, they can give you a warning. That's simply, they write to you and they say, we think you're in breach, and don't do it again, basically. If you do it again, it gets more serious. Right, okay, you've had your warning. More serious, generally, caution. Caution is the same as if you're stopped by the police because you're a little bit drunk one night and being a bit loud, and they say, right, we're going to give you a police caution. It's the same idea. You have to accept that you're guilty, but nothing else happens. So you get a criminal record, but you don't go to court, you don't get fined. But that becomes really significant now, for a reason I'll come on to in a second. Environmental civil sanctions, that's a new idea that because if you get a prohibition or an enforcement notice, which is perhaps considered more serious, that's basically telling you have to stop doing the activity, or you have to make some changes to your system in order to get back in compliance with your permit. Any sort of notice, any sort of prosecution, any sort of caution is on your record. That's important because every time now a company has to go through a tender or wants to enter into a new contract with a customer, they will be asked, have you got any cautions? Have you got any enforcement notices? Have you ever been prosecuted? And if you have to answer yes to any of these, and usually it's for the last 5 years, so if you have to admit to these, that might risk you getting a major contract. And I've definitely had clients where fairly small black mark on their record has meant they've lost contracts worth millions of pounds. So suddenly these things become really important, even low-level breaches. So this idea, the civil sanctions, is an idea where instead of having a criminal record, you accept that you're wrong, you make a donation to an environmental charity, which the Environment Agency specifies, or you agree with them, and then you don't get a criminal record. So you admit that you're wrong, you sort your processes out, but you deal with it in a different way. It's very similar to what happens for non-payment of tax, or you might have seen last 2 or 3 weeks Rolls-Royce made a big payment about alleged corruption. It's the same idea that instead of, because often the hardest bit for these big companies is not paying the money, it's admitting that they were in breach because of the damage that does to your reputation. So in order to stop having years of legal arguments and fights in court and all the rest, you do a deal where you say, right, we're not going to admit to anything in a criminal sense, but we'll repay this money that we should have paid in tax, or we'll make a donation to an environmental charity and we'll prove to you we've sorted out the problem, it won't happen again. It sounds a little bit underhand, but in practice it works far better for companies. But that's because the sanction of getting any one of these is very severe. So we mentioned the notices that stop you doing something or mean you have to do it differently, or prosecution is the end one. So for a really bad breach, they don't have to go through all of these. Their policy says, oh, it's too serious, straight to prosecution. And that could mean now tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds, possibly millions. There have been fines for millions of pounds. So if you are repeatedly in breach, or you create a very, very nasty, you kill the fish in a river for miles and miles down there, that's the sort of thing a big company would be getting fined millions of pounds for. So it has a big financial hit and a huge reputational hit. And that's been a real change in the last 10 years, that now big companies, particularly global ones, they don't want to go anywhere near any of these because of the damage to their reputation.
Question.
Yep.
Regarding this, so they have called bribing you.
Yep.
So they are not, they are admitting their crime.
Yep.
Yeah, and they're not going to have a like punishment, criminal punishment. They will be just tax
Yeah,
or fine, yeah, and they will go with it.
yeah, yeah. That's
So
it.
this is the regulation.
It is the way it's starting to work now. Yes, but I'll pick that up at the end because we'll come back to bribery and corruption. But it's the same. Yeah.
So they will pay the UK government to fine
Yeah,
for the corrupting the other third countries.
yeah.
So that's it.
That's it. Yeah.
So that is the previous page,
Yes.
for example, like PP has offshore oil platform, they generate hazardous waste from the offshore platform and contracted with third party or dispose something like that.
Yeah.
In that case, the responsibility for that hazardous waste will be transferred to this third party company or PP still is responsible until the end of this hazardous waste.
Yeah, it is possible that they can contract with other companies to take that waste away, provided they're properly regulated. And some companies will treat the hazardous waste themselves, others will take it to a third party who treats it, and maybe somebody else who disposes of it. So you can do it different ways. The idea is you've got to understand how to treat your waste and then have the right people in place and have all the evidence to show it's gone through the right people. So you have a choice as long as you can show that it's ended up being properly treated and gone to the right place.
Right, what I mean is, if PP contract with third party companies, can they forget about this hazardous waste because they already transport hazardous waste?
I've got you. Not completely. What I mean is if you go back to that duty of care, just because you contract with another company, and even if they're a really good, reputable company, you've still got to know and get the evidence that they've dealt with it properly. And that's why the whole duty of care works, because there used to be companies who would say, oh, well, I paid them loads of money, I can forget about it. It doesn't quite work like that. Usually in practice, that is why well-known, reputable companies charge you a lot more than others, and you are entitled to rely on them a lot more, but that doesn't mean you've got no responsibility. And even when companies are used, Veolia, Suez, all these big international names, if something goes wrong, everybody gets looked at, and it's about how well, if you ask for information, if they've told you it's all fine, then you might be all right. But if you haven't asked those questions, you're at risk. Yeah.
Do these rules change at all, or whether they run all the way up to
Generally, it's territorial waters or offshore installations and connections to it. There is always a slight sort of grey area for the bit in between the countries, but there are specific requirements that cover offshore installations and all the connections to it. Yeah. Okay. Next. Right, so moving on then to health and safety law. I said at the start of the environmental that is compliance based, so you can't do anything without a permit that says you're compliant with the requirements. Health and safety is very much the other way around them. You can do anything that you like as long as you've assessed the risks of that, and you've either eliminated those risks or reduced them as far as reasonably practicable. So environmental, you have to go to an agency and get a permit. Health and safety, you regulate yourself, but if something goes wrong, you've got to show that you've reduced the risk as much as you can. So it's a different way legally to working. And what that says is, from the 1974 Health and Safety Work, etc. Act, you've got a duty to ensure, so not just try, but ensure is a very high duty, the health, safety and welfare of your employees. So everybody who's your employee is covered by Section 2. But it's broader than that, because Section 3 applies the same duty but to non-employees. Typically non-employees, contractors, the main one, members of the public, visitors to your site. And that's often where it differs, because certainly in a lot, America in particular has very similar laws but just about employees. They're far less about other people who might be affected. That's not to say you can't ignore them, but they're not covered in the same way. Whereas in the UK, everybody really. So whether they're your employees or whether they're a contractor on your site or a member of the public outside, you've still got the same duty to ensure the health, safety and welfare of those people as far as reasonably practicable. And that, again, because it's risk-based, that test will change. Again, that's different. In the US, they have much more like environmental. They have standards. If you hit them, you're compliant, that's it. In the UK, how do you demonstrate what's reasonably practicable? And it will change over time. So what you might have done 10 years ago might have been fine, but 10 years later, technology moves on, procedures change and improve, people get more knowledgeable about risk, and so your standards are always going up. So a lot of businesses talk about continuous improvement, and that is why you're constantly looking and reassessing your risks on a regular basis. So section 2 and 3, they apply to the company, the employer of the person or who engages with third parties. These two, section 7 and 37, they apply to individuals. So section 7 applies to every employee of a company. They have a legal duty to look after themselves and anybody else who might be affected by what they do or don't do. And that's quite important, because nearly every serious incident, quite a lot of the fatalities I've dealt with are because people have not done something they should. They've not followed their training. They've not worn their correct equipment. They've taken a shortcut. Often with the best of intentions, they want to get the job done. They want to help out and get the work finished. But they do something dangerous and they get hurt. And they have a legal duty there. So as well as getting hurt or getting worse, you're committing a criminal offence. So if you do something at work that puts one of your colleagues in danger, you're more likely to be prosecuted, but it could just be you. And you can go to prison for up to 2 years. So lots of incidents I've seen where companies spend a fortune putting guards and auto stops on machinery, and people decide that actually they'll just, rather than doing it properly, they'll take the guard off and they'll put their hand in because they've dropped their spanner, and then funnily enough they come out with no fingers. Happens very regularly. You'd be very surprised the number of times people take dangerous shortcuts. Section 37 is for more senior people in an organisation. So 7 applies to everybody, but if you're a senior manager, a director, and you know that things aren't being done right, then that's a separate offence again. If the company commits an offence, and that's because of your consent, connivance, neglect, basically if you knew or should have known things weren't right, then again you can go to prison for up to 2 years. And these are the things that when something does go wrong, individuals get asked lots of questions by the regulators, possibly by the police. And that applies in every business. You then have a whole load of separate regulatory duties, but they all link back to this. What I mean by that is everything you can then think of that might be dangerous, there are sets of regulations saying what you should do. So working at height, pressure systems, chemicals and hazardous substances, lifting equipment, provision and use of work equipment, so that's around guarding and machinery safety, management of health and safety. There's dozens of those, but all of them basically say whatever you do, it's got to be the right equipment for the job, fit for purpose, it's got to be regularly maintained so it's in good condition. Whoever uses it has to be properly trained, supervised, instructed. It's all fairly common sense. But if you don't do that and something goes wrong, then the regulator will come looking for you. At its worst case, you also have possible manslaughter. So people might have heard of manslaughter, of homicide, in relation to, say, a fight and someone gets stabbed, and that's homicide if they die. but it also applies in a work setting if somebody dies. So this is the test that gets used. Did you have a duty of care to the deceased? Did you owe a duty? We've just seen, yes you did. Section 7, you've got a duty to look after yourself and anybody else. So if one of your work colleagues dies, chances are you were working with them, you had a duty. Has there been a breach? So if you've not followed a procedure or a process, there's a breach. Has that breach been a substantial cause of the death? So you failed to follow the procedures, as a result somebody's died. Yeah, so these three are generally quite easy. This is then the test. Is that breach so grossly negligent, so very, very bad, that it should be criminal and not just normal negligence? And that's for a jury to decide. So that's very difficult, that I go into a scenario, and I've done sadly many of these. Somebody's been killed in a nasty accident at work, and there are questions asked of a manager or a supervisor. Did you know that that guy was working in there without correct equipment, wasn't properly trained, didn't follow the procedure? And if they go, well, yes, but I thought they were okay, you're into dangerous territory. The reason there's a picture of a medic on there is that this person, Mr. Adamarco, was an anaesthetist in an eye operation. And partway through the operation, one of the ventilation tubes became detached. And all the alarms are going on the machines. He said, it's fine, it's okay, I've got it under control. He didn't have it under control. The evidence in the trial, because the patient then died, is that a competent anaesthetist, a good anaesthetist, would have spotted in 2.5 seconds that this was a major problem. It took Mr. Adamarco 4.5 minutes to realise that something was badly wrong. So between 2.5 seconds and 4.5 minutes, the question is then for the jury, when does that become criminal? When's that so bad? When's that move from just being a mistake to just being, no, this is really bad, unacceptable? And in that case, the jury very quickly said, no, that's criminal. This patient was in that person's care, they failed to follow, they breached the duty, that's caused the person to die, that's so bad, it's criminal. But the problem is you've got a jury deciding that, and the juries may think all sorts of different things. This does happen. It's still relatively rare, but it does get pushed onto people in interview situations quite regularly. I'm working with a colleague at the moment preparing for an interview with somebody for this in a couple of weeks. So it is serious when it happens, and also these investigations can take years. So it might be 18 months, 2 years down the line before the investigators decide maybe they won't prosecute you. But that means you've got a long time of that hanging over your head. Previous health and safety breaches up to 2 years in prison. This is potentially up to life in prison. Unlikely you get that, but you might be looking at 5 years, 10 years. And bear in mind, these are not people who are criminals who've been in court or in trouble all the time. These are typically normal men and women who go to work to do a job and something goes badly wrong. So it's a very stressful scenario.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So what's happening between during that period of time as to the investigation?
Usually, for this sort of work-related incident, you're not in prison, you're not on remand, you're out and free, but you're expected that you have to go to interviews. So if the police say, right, we want to interview you, you have to agree a date and turn up. And then a lot of it is waiting. So a lot of it is if questions have to be answered, you prepare and you answer them, but then you wait for another few months because they go and look at other things. And that's often the worst time for the individuals, because they just want it to be finished. And I say, well, it can't be finished, it might be another year. And
Can you go to work?
yes, you should be able to work, as long as it's not affecting you so badly that you can't do your job. What is a real problem, though, is what if you wanted to move jobs? What if you got offered a great promotion at another company? You'd have to tell them that this was hanging over your head. Would they give you that job? Probably not. Even promotion in the same company. becomes very difficult because you might have been the person in charge of that incident, and so the company says, look, we support you, we're behind you, we don't think you've done anything wrong, but we can't promote you now. You've got to stay until this is finished. So it really puts, so you can work, but it puts your career on hold in many ways.
Just questions. First, what sanctions are more severe? The ones applied for managers and senior managers or everyday employees? And the second one, what was the sentence of this other man? Sir.
For employees and managers, the maximum sentence is the same, up to 2 years. In practice, usually for managers, it's a little bit more because they're seen as they should have done something more to stop it. If you're convicted of manslaughter, it will now be more than 2 years, most cases. This case happened 20 years ago. Mr. Adamarco was given a suspended sentence, which means he didn't go straight to prison. That's always possible, but increasingly now, people do go to prison. But nearly always when they do, it's for very obviously dangerous things. People making employees do dangerous things, breaking all sorts of rules. It's rare that this is for an innocent mistake, if you like. This is because people have not done what they should. Okay. And this is really what's driving a lot of the changes. That's the front cover of the guideline that I have to use on a regular basis now. So the court brought in a new guideline 1st of February last year. So up until that point, there were no written guidelines. We had what's called a system of case law. So cases built up over years, judges would look at similar cases. That's all changed now. We've got a guideline that works through a number of different phases. So you're expected to go through a 9-stage test to decide what's the sentence that the court imposes. And that's the same for companies who would be fined or individuals who could go to prison or could be fined. And you work, where's the last page? And the reason for this is that these were, there were lots of, particularly for companies, there were lots of fines that even though they were quite big, for the size of the company, they were tiny. So for example, for price fixing, if you're guilty of price fixing, you can be fined 10% of your turnover. So if you're a multi-billion-pound company, that's tens of millions, hundreds of millions. You kill somebody and you're that size company, in the past you were perhaps fined £300,000, £500,000. And there were lots of people saying, that's not right, it should be more serious. So now it's not percentage terms, but it is linked to your turnover. So the bigger the company, the bigger the fine. And this is a way of getting there. So culpability, how far below the standard did you fall? A long way or just a little bit? The harm, what was the risk of harm? Was the risk only ever going to be that somebody might get their finger trapped in the door? Not very nice, but not going to kill them. Or is the risk so bad that actually there is a risk of death? Unfortunately, a lot of activities, particularly the sort of industries you may end up in, will carry a risk of death straight away. Anything to do with working at height, electricity, gas, pressure, chemicals, risk of death if something goes wrong in a lot of cases. So you then have this starting point in the range. So they have tables. How big are your company? Where do you fall on these culpability? And you follow it along and you say, well, here's your starting point. So typically for a big company is anything over 50 million, which is not very big at all. So if you're anything above 50 million for turnover, you're in the large company category. So for a typical breach, somebody gets their arm badly hurt in a machine that wasn't guarded. Starting point might be £1 million, and the range might be £500,000 for less serious, up to 3 million, roughly. Very large companies, so if you're in the billions, you're potentially off the charts as well. So the judge then has to say, well, what are the mitigating and aggravating features? What makes it worse? What makes it less bad? So if you've never been in trouble before, you've got a good safety record, you've got lots of policies, this was an isolated incident, then the fine might get lower. If this is the third time you've been in court and you don't care about safety and you cut lots of corners, the fine's going to be lots higher. And the court balances all of these things up. But it's definitely leading, in the last 12 months, it's about a 10-fold increase. So for fines 12 months ago, you stick another 0 on the end. And that's what we're saying to clients. Fines that might have been 80, 100,000 pounds, they're now 800 to a million. Fatalities are now certainly 1 million, 2 million and going up. So it's changed quite dramatically in the last 12 months or so.
Excuse me. So in case of fatality, do we compensate maybe the relatives of the person who has died or if you
Very good question. Back to what I said at the start, these are criminal. So these are fines and they go to the government. There will be separate proceedings for the family or for the injured person, and they will get compensation, but that's civil and that's dealt with by insurers. But it's a very good question because these sorts of fines, millions of pounds, again, that doesn't go anywhere near the family or the injured person. That just goes to the government. The family will probably get a similar sum or more, but it's separate proceedings. And then these are the other factors they have to look at, but I'll not trouble you with those. Here's a couple of examples you might have seen. Alton Towers, big theme park in the UK, had a terrible incident about nearly 2 years ago where one of their cars went round the roller coaster and they left another car out because of earlier failings, and it smashed into the back of it. Nobody was killed, but 4 sort of teenagers, early 20s, suffered awful injuries. 2 or 3 of them lost their legs. They were trapped for hours and hours, half stuck in this roller coaster. Lots of publicity. They were fined £5 million, so even though nobody's killed, they're fined £5 million. In addition, they lost about 40 to 45 million off their share price because of the bad publicity, and a similar amount in terms of lost revenue. So you see the impact now for a big household name company. And they were also starting to look at how much, because they were trying to argue to get the fine lower, and the judge said, well, I'm going to look at your accounts and I'm going to look at how much your executives get paid. So your chief executives getting bonuses of £400,000 or £500,000. Don't try and pretend to me you've got no money, so I'm going to fine you a big amount. But they do that. They literally go through your accounts, they look at what people are paid, and they look at every aspect of it. So just moving on then to corporate manslaughter. So if somebody dies, then you potentially have Section 2, Section 3. That still applies for a death. But you also possibly have corporate manslaughter. So that's if the way in which the activities, the organisation's activities are managed or organised by its senior managers. What does that mean? Basically, the old law, before this act came in about 10 years ago, you had to find one individual and they had to be a directing mind of the company, and that was very hard. You think of a big company, you'd have directors up here, loads of layers of management, people making mistakes down here. So for big companies under the old law, very difficult. All this act does is take away that need for an individual, and it's much broader. So it's about management, systems, systemic failure. So if your systems don't work, if your company says it's going to do all of this good stuff and it fails and your procedures fail and people don't follow the training or the equipment's not maintained and all of that leads to somebody being killed, is that way in which the activities have been managed or organised? Again, matter for the jury. So for a big company where something's gone horribly wrong, big disasters, this came off the back of a number of train crashes in the early 2000s. If a jury's looking at that, will they convict and say, no, that company was just poorly run? Did it cause a person's death? Does it amount to a gross breach of a relevant duty of care? That's the same test as we saw on that Adamarco slide. That's for the jury to decide, is this failure by the company so bad as to be criminal? This has not been used very much. There was a lot of publicity around this 10 years ago when it came in. It's been used maybe about 50, 60 times. So it's been used a lot more than the old law, but still not very much, and still only for very small companies. And I think now, because of the guidelines we've just seen, the fines are going to be so big for health and safety breaches, which are frankly much easier to prove. I don't think there'll be as many cases for manslaughter. So everyone gets focused on manslaughter, and it's a big scary thing, but in practice the health and safety is probably more significant. Unlimited fines are the penalties for companies, but that links back to the guidelines we've just said. So although it's unlimited, the court must follow that process to decide. Imprisonment for individuals we've talked about, but all in all could be very serious. Who investigates? This is, I'll go through these quite quickly, but it shows you just how complicated it is. So if you have a workplace fatality, you will get the police. So the police will send a senior team, same as if there'd been a stabbing or a robbery or a major incident. They're not specially trained industrial expert. The HSE, the health and safety executive, often work alongside because they have the industry expertise, they understand about processes, procedures, and they work with the police and do a joint investigation. But the police are in charge. Where somebody's died as well, you have the role of the coroner. That's a separate role about how did the person meet their death. That's to learn lessons. That's not about blame. That's about can we learn lessons to protect people in the future. But the police also pass all their information to the coroner. You then have the HSE prosecuting health and safety offences. We have the Crown Prosecution Service, again, mainstream crime. They prosecute for corporate and individual manslaughter. This is why it takes years to deal with these cases, because all of these different people have to gather the evidence, review it, go back and gather more evidence, review it again, take a decision, take it to court. It just gets really complicated. And when you're looking at the powers that they have, the health and safety executive has more powers than the police. They don't need a warrant. If it's a workplace, they can enter it. They can seize documents again without a warrant. They can require you to answer questions. So you can have a voluntary interview. That's like you saw a car crash on the way home and the police say, will you give a statement? They have that. They also have the power, if you decide, no, I don't want to give a statement, well, you have to. You have to answer these questions, and if you don't, that's a separate offence that you could go to prison for. They can't use the answers against you personally, because that would breach your human rights and all the rest, but they can use it against your employer, against the company. So if you've got a witness who's unwilling, usually they're unwilling because they know they've done something wrong. So they can either go after the individual personally, or they can say, well, look, we'll give you a bit of protection because we can't use your answers, but you must tell us what you know and we'll go after your employer. So they've got some very, very broad powers which create all sorts of challenges. Police, on the other hand, they are the police. Generally, people remain quite nervous about dealing with the police. They tend to want them off the premises. It's not good publicity to have police cars parked outside your factory for days and days and all this sort of tape everywhere. They've got far more people to rely on. HSE, if they even a serious incident, might have a handful of people. Police will have loads. So if it's a major incident, you'll have police all over. Fear factor. Staff get very scared. If you say somebody's been really hurt and the police want to interview you, everyone goes, whoa, why? What have I done? It's not me. So a lot of my job, or my team's job, after a serious incident, we help manage all of this. We help pull all the pieces together so that you can give the best answers you can. That's just about investigations. We'll skip that. And this is ultimately why it's so important. This is what happens if things go wrong. These are pictures of the Deepwater Horizon rig, Macondo, in the Gulf of Mexico about 6-7 years ago now. And what's quite significant for me, though, I mean, an awful incident in itself, when you read the reports that come out of it, they're the same things that come up time and again in major incidents. Identifiable mistakes. Things that could have been spotted if people, all the warning signs were there, but people didn't react to them. If anybody's seen the film of that, quite representative of investigations I've done. People say this isn't right, and somebody finding a way to say, no, it'll be fine, it'll be okay. Systemic failures in risk management. So people having systems but not actually following them. Talks then about safety culture. This is another big thing. What does culture mean to a business? What is its safety culture? It's quite a hard thing to put your finger on, but these are questions being asked now in most of the investigations we deal with. And this is why, because this is the Ministry of Justice's guidelines to the police for corporate manslaughter investigations. What should they be asking questions about? I'm not going to go through all of them, you can see, but they're fairly straightforward. Systems of work, training, supervision, etc., risk assessment. But these bottom two, how are procedures carried out on the ground? This is the big problem for big businesses. They've got loads of bits of paper that tell them all these great policies and procedures, and people just are too busy, they don't know what they're doing, they don't follow. This final one, corporate culture as to safety. Do businesses really get safety, or is it just a nice sign on the wall saying safety is really important? And these are the levels that investigations are now getting into. Conscious of the time, but quick whiz through bribery just to give you a heads up on that. Bribery Act 2010 brought in, it's directly applicable in the UK, but it covers global operations. So if you're a UK business operating globally, this applies wherever you operate. 4 new offences: active bribery, passive bribery, bribing a public official, and corporate offence of failing to prevent any one of those. Active bribery, fairly obvious. You give somebody a brown envelope of cash to get a contract. Passive bribery is where you know it's going on and you look the other way. So that's more for managers who have to sign off, well, where's this money coming from? All right, I don't want to know, just make it happen. Bribing a foreign public official, that's particularly common in certain parts of the world to get your equipment through the port or to deal with customs tariffs or whatever. Instead of things getting held up for weeks or months, you leave an envelope and suddenly your trucks get cleared to come through. And then this is the big one for companies, failing to prevent any of these by associated persons. That's very broad, as we'll see in a second. So unless it can show it's got adequate procedures in place to prevent bribery, then the company is instantly at fault. So most big companies now, one of the first things you will do when you start your induction, will tell you about the company and should tell you about health and safety. We'll also say, right, here's an anti-bribery, money laundering thing, and you sit and watch videos online and you have to answer a load of questions. That's part of their system to show they've tried to say, this is not acceptable, you are at risk, we're at risk, don't do it, don't go anywhere near it. So whether or not senior managers knew what's going on, if you don't have these systems in place, you're in trouble. And this is why associate persons are so broad, because it's employees, it's contractors, it's suppliers, it's any joint ventures or subsidiaries. And this is often really hard because you get lots of big businesses saying, well, look, we don't do this, we don't encourage it, but we know our competitors do, so how do they get away with it? Why can't we do what they do? The short answer is, you just can't take that risk. Because if it all goes wrong, directors can be involved personally. Again, consent, connivance, turning a blind eye, failing to investigate, that's all seen just as seriously. And you get unlimited fines. So we've seen unlimited fines for health and safety, unlimited fines for companies for bribery. Worse though, imprisonment of up to 10 years. So even more serious than killing or injuring somebody. Disqualified as a director, so you basically can't work again, and you're likely to get sacked. So, quick canter through that, but quite significant in terms of the impact for businesses. Those are my details on the end. You should get these, I think, on Blackboard, so you've got all the access. If you have got any follow-up questions or queries, do drop me a line, send me an email. Hopefully not too scary, but in a serious sense you need to be aware of this because it applies to the businesses you will work for and you personally when you're working for them. Okay. Super. I'm conscious of the time. It looks like there's people outside, but I'll hang around if there's anybody got any questions. Thanks very much.